Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Horizon Zero Dawn running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U and the 5600U. So we are taking a look at a comparison here between Zen 2 APUs and Zen 3 APUs in terms of the Ryzen 5 series, and this is running on Horizon Zero Dawn's built-in benchmark. Now the game is currently running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphical settings, which is the favor performance mode, and FSR is set to performance. Now at 1080p, you'll see that the performance that we're getting on both chips is relatively comparable, but you will notice that the 5600U does have lower 1% lows. Now there are moments where things will stutter here and there, and you'll see that the frame times do kind of fluctuate here and there. It's overall a comparable experience, but the 5600U is consistently producing a overall worse experience. And I'm not 100% sure what it is that's happening there, because if you look at the clock speed of the GPU, it's actually clocking higher than the 5500U by a significant margin. In some sections, it is reaching up to 600 hertz higher, and yet we're getting pretty much identical FPS, and our 1% lows are still worse on the 5600U, and the frame times in general just look noticeably worse. So we're definitely getting a repeat of a previous situation where the 5600U was just performing worse than the 5500U, even though they're running at the same TDP, and you'll notice that the 5600U is getting higher GPU clock. I'm not 100% sure what's going on there, and we're even using more RAM on the 5600U, and it's not giving us any real noticeable benefit. And this is after running this 3 times on each chip. That's what I do. I run these at I run it 3 times. Usually it's going to give me a consistent experience. If it doesn't, I'll run more until I get, like if there's any outliers, I'll remove those. So this is not an outlier situation. This is consistently what the chip was producing here. And really, while you're actually playing the games, the difference in terms of performance is going to be not really noticeable. They're practically identical, really, in terms of actual gameplay, but it's one of those things where it is still interesting to see that even though the 5600U is capable of producing a higher clock speed on that GPU, it's not enough to close the gap that it has with the 5500U. And this is a very odd situation because I've had this happen already with another game. So I'm curious to see if there's something going on with the 5600U. Maybe it really does just come down to the fact that these are 2 different chassis, but if so, then what would be the limiting factor there? Now, if we switch things up and drop the resolution down to 720p while maintaining the same settings, we can see what the performance would be like. And you'll see here that now the 5600U is able to stretch its legs a bit more here. So it's actually able to produce a higher level of performance. Again, though, you will see that the RAM usage is just higher on the 5600U. Again, identical setting. Everything is exactly the same between the two. They both are rocking 16 gigabytes of RAM. They're both running at the same 3200 megahertz RAM speed. So there are, besides the chassis being different from each other, they are essentially the same components, besides the fact that also we're dealing with a 5500U and a 5600U. So the fact that there is a noticeable difference at 1080p is interesting to me, especially because at 720p that difference is practically eliminated. You'll see that the 1% lows and the averages are just only slightly ahead of the 5500U, to the point where you could reasonably just say that they're identical. This is margin of error. 1 FPS or 2 FPS are really not going to be a deciding factor on whether or not you're going to get either of these chips. And it's very interesting to see that it's not an overall win all the time for the 5600U. Now, I'm very tempted at this point to pick up a system, if I can find one cheap enough, that will actually let me unlock the TDP. If I could find actually this HP Pavilion 15 with a 5625U, I would probably just pick that up just for comparison's sake. But from what I have currently available to me right now, you can pretty much just see that the HP Pavilion Aero 13 at 720p does at least close the gap in performance, but it's at 1080p that there is a noticeable difference. Now, personally, I would not play the game at 1080p on either chip anyway, but it is one of those things that it is within playable territory where if you're someone that grew up playing games on like the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, you're more than likely used to the level of FPS and the visual quality that you had to play at. But with that being said, it is one of those things where me personally, I would rather play the game at like 720p, or really 900p is the target resolution I would go for in this game, just because FSR really helps smooth out a lot of the issues that 900p tends to have on 1080p monitor. But of course, the 5500U does have another trick up its sleeve, and it's the fact that the HP Pavilion 15 actually does let me raise the TDP of it all the way up to 25 watts. I can actually go higher than that, but 25 watts is realistically the limit of this specific chassis without getting into more exotic and, quite frankly, impractical cooling methods. So let me show you the results of the 5500U running at 25 watts compared to the the 15 watts of the 5600U. And as you can see, the performance difference is pretty noticeable here. The 25 watts really let the 5500U actually flex its muscle here. You'll see that the GPU is pretty much clocked at the maximum speed almost all the time. Sometimes it'll drop down a little bit, but it's nowhere dropping down as much as it was before. And this pretty much gives it a chance to pull a lead over the 5600U, which is again struggling with those 1% lows at 1080p. And that is something that the 5500U has pretty much just completely dealt with, because now our 1% lows are in the 30 range. So that means that we're getting a very smooth experience while playing the game, because it's going to be very close to just a rock solid consistent 30 FPS. Meanwhile, the 5600U with its 15 watt limit pretty much ends up in a situation where those 1% lows will drop down low enough that I would just suggest that you just don't play like this. You'll just notice overall that things stutter a lot more. But again, the clock speed is not that far away from where we were at with the 5500U. And while the 5500U is now clocking higher, before it wasn't, and it was still performing better. I think the 5600U might actually be my favorite chip that I've ever tested, just because of the fact that it's been so interesting to see what things trigger it and what don't. You know, some games will work perfectly fine. It'll actually perform better than the 5500U, but then you try others and the 5500U is performing better than the 5600U. And it's like, why? What is going on there that is causing this issue? And I mean, in this situation here, of course, the 25 watt TDP is really just a saving grace that makes the 1080p experience in this game just a whole lot better. But even then, I still would not play like that, especially because as I've been using these laptops more, I've come to appreciate the lower noise and lower temperatures of the 15 watt TDP, especially because the performance jump that you see isn't necessarily super high in a lot of games. Now, certain ones for sure, you'll get an improvement in the 1% lows. Overall, it'll give you a smooth experience. And if you're already teetering on the edge of playability, like this chip was at 1080p, it can really give you that extra push that makes the experience actually enjoyable. But of course, we can drop things down a bit more, down to 720p, which is where the 5600U was actually able to bring itself back to compete with the 5500U properly. So let's see if it can do that with the 25 watt TDP on the 5500U. And as you can see at 720p, it's really just an overall comparable experience. Though the 5500U still manages to pull a little bit ahead, it really isn't by a significant margin. It was actually kind of shocking to me how much it actually closed the gap between the two. Again, I don't know what it is about the 1080p resolution that really just pushes the 5600U to weird territory. For sure, the 5500U is producing a higher FPS. It's not significantly larger, you know, again, 3 FPS is really just not that big of a deal, but it's just one of those things where it is producing a better experience. Though look at those temperatures that we're at compared to the 5600U. Like, there is a noticeable difference in terms of the amount of heat being generated. And overall, I think that the 5600U is able to provide a better experience here, just in the sense that while actually trying to play the games on the systems, well, the HP Pavilion 15 can actually get pretty loud, especially at these higher temperatures where it's really trying hard to cool things down. And this is with me having my AC on and blasting really hard so that the room does not heat up or anything like that. This is the most ideal situation for the 5500U set at 25 watts in this chassis. Overall, though, I am very interested to see how things are going to shape up overall with the 5600U, because it really does seem to be struggling against the 5500U in certain titles. And the fact that it just does not allow me to set it to 25 watts on the HP Pavilion Aero 13 really is a huge bummer. But you can see here that like the performance difference is noticeable enough at 720p at a lower TDP and lower temperatures overall that like I would give the win, at least in this scenario, to the 5600U, because it's able to produce almost identical FPS to the 5500U without having to produce as much noise and heat, and an overall smaller chassis. But if there's one overall conclusion to take out of this, is that you need to pay attention to whether or not the laptop that you're interested in getting will actually let you adjust the TDP if that's something that you're interested in. If you have no interest in that, that's perfectly fine, obviously. But if you're running things stock, it really does seem like the 5500U in general is keeping up pretty well with the 5600U, to the point where if you could get yourself a laptop with a 5500U for a very cheap price, it might just be the way to go, honestly. The 5500U is just holding up extremely well for 2022. But anyways, I hope you found this comparison useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.